during our training to benefit those that we're working with on a daily basis. Let me move this ahead a little bit. Basically, the idea and what it's about, and I'll talk a little bit about what it's about and what it's not about, is the idea that we can tap into that inner researcher to improve care, to improve efficiency, and using some of the basic research design, data, and statistics even to make those improvements in our clinical settings. And then consider whether or not we want to engage in something that's far broader in terms of contributions to the literature and more formal research. But the idea here is that, again, as we've gone through all our training, we sat through statistics classes, through design classes, and read papers, produced papers, potentially, certainly did other literature searches and even empirical studies on our way to becoming psychologists. And maybe some of you, and you don't have to acknowledge this publicly if you don't want to, might have enjoyed some of that. You might have actually been interested in design or something like that. Now, I know it's not a popular thing to say, and at times could get you shunned by colleagues, but it's something that may be something you can tap into to utilize on a daily basis. And the idea in thinking about this as the idea of the inner researcher is tapping into some of the things that people have talked about lately around really finding things that bring you joy outside the day-to-day. And yes, there are those opportunities to find joy even in our day-to-day work. As we work as clinicians and as we serve the patients who come to us, one of the things that we do is develop hypotheses about them. Develop those internally, we test them out internally. We take that particular perspective, that essential empirical view of psychology that is a clear bias that I have. And what I'm suggesting is that sometimes that can really be broadened to provide some additional resource to your clinic, to your teams, to the folks that you serve, regardless of the setting. The talk is primarily informed by a VA perspective. It's in terms of these particular approaches where I've lived a significant part of my life in terms of the kinds of things that we can do to engage in research-style activities that will help improve clinical care for individual patients, for groups of patients you work with, or your teams. So also know that application to your setting may vary. Don't get into in great detail a number of the different policies, procedures, and different rules and regulations that you will want to follow up on, that you will want to make sure you're maintaining essentially the right line of with regard to some of the aspects that are unique to different settings when you begin to collect and collate information and data about those that you serve. It's also an approach that I really do consider to be atheoretical with regard to treatment approaches. This is not about whether or not you're cognitive behavioral in your approach, or you're psychodynamic in your approach, or functional analytic, whatever it might be. The idea is that those variables, those things that are important to you and important to those that you're working with, are the things that you can use some of these basic skills, some of these different approaches that your inner researcher might be able to bring forth to provide additional improvement and additional opportunities for folks. So what it's not about, I think, is also important too. This is not about randomized clinical trials. This is not about developing projects within your day-to-day or with individual patients that are going to meet the extraordinary standards that must be attained to conduct a randomized clinical trial. This is, again, about trying to do some of these things in your day-to-day practice, in your day-to-day clinic that may be beneficial, that may be of interest. It's not about grant writing. Granted, some of this may lead to that. You may find yourself really dare I say, enjoying the research process. And you'll move further towards that and think about it. But that's not what we're talking about for this group or this particular topic. It's not about sophisticated statistics. Are there some that you'll use? Yes, because those really help us not only in terms of looking at when we talk about single case designs, eyeballing data, but as we get aggregate data, being able to identify some things that are more statistically tangible. It's not about preparing IRB submissions. The whole idea here is that we're going to look at process improvement for the most part until we talk research at the very end. So it's not about that. It's not about large-scale program evaluation projects that involve full systems or entire clinics, or I'm sorry, not clinics, because we will talk about clinics a little bit, but entire medical centers or something along those lines. It's not about requesting protected research time. Might you do that? Yes. You might be able to talk to your particular leadership about a particular time frame where you want to do that if you're going to engage in actual research. If you're going to engage in process improvement kinds of approaches and process improvement kinds of ideas, it really is going to be more along the lines of what I said at the beginning. This is work that brings you some joy, brings you some intellectual pleasure, some interest, some additional motivation for serving those that you serve, and is going to be additional time that you will be putting in. And it's not specifically tapping into the ideas of transformational coaching, the Lean Six Sigma, or Plan to Study Act cycles. It may lead to some of those, but oftentimes this kind of work might be preparatory to that. It might be the idea that leads to a much more formal program evaluation or large-scale project that you're looking at. It's based essentially on the idea that regardless of the training model that you came through, practitioner-scholar, practitioner-scientist, scholar-practitioner, scientist-practitioner, clinical scientist, each one of those training models involved courses in research design and statistics as part of the program, as part of the approach to the training. It is that idea that whether or not you are currently engaged in formal research processes, whether or not you're somebody who came from a particular location and are now involved in clinical trials or full-time research positions or even part-time research positions, we have that training. We have that component to us that makes us unique in a variety of different ways. It gives us a particular perspective that infuses, in my biased opinion, I was biased early on, that provides us with a particularly sophisticated way of approaching the work that we do. We generate hypotheses. We do test them out with the folks that we serve in the treatments that we provide. We observe carefully. We collate and gather that data with the patients that we work with. Whether we're doing it on an Excel spreadsheet or not, it's that kind of information that we're utilizing to help guide, shape, inform, and improve the treatment that we deliver to everybody that we serve. So these kinds of approaches and these kinds of skills have been a part of our particular professional identity for a long time, and have certainly been parts of what we've been trained in. So the idea then is there a way to begin to use those skills perhaps more directly, perhaps more overtly, in a way to identify places where things can be improved, places where you can better serve the folks that are coming to us. Again, the overall objectives are looking at the difference between process quality improvement projects and a research project. It's an important distinction. Once you push over to research, there is an entirely different set of standards and set of activities and things that you need to engage in. To begin to use research principles to directly improve clinical practice, we'll talk about that a little bit more formally, and describe a practice-based research network, so the ones that were laid out. Looking at those a little bit more in detail, one of the things to think about in terms of this idea of process and quality improvement projects is the idea of really being clear about what you're doing as a sign of respect to those that you serve. As a former IRB chair, one of the things that was that I found troubling at times were folks that would come and say, you know, we've been doing this sort of thing, and we had no idea that we were going to really decide that we wanted to turn this project into something publishable, and now we'd like to bring it to the IRB. And we want to make sure that this goes through as an archival study, and therefore we don't need to obtain informed consent from those that. Part of the ethics of research is really respecting those that we serve and ensuring that they are actively aware of what's going on. So if you're going to engage in research, identify the fact that you're going to engage in research and follow that process. Don't sort of Trojan horse it in as a process quality improvement project that suddenly morphs with a brilliant insight into a research project. On the other hand, if you really do start it out this way and it begins to evolve into a research project, that's fantastic. That's really the way that you can begin to identify some of these elements of our day-to-day practice that can be directly improved by the application of research principles. Again, it respects those that you serve and it keeps your IRB happy. Be clear about what you want to do. We'll talk about that definition in just a minute. You can use research principles to directly improve clinical practice with individual patients, all or specific groups of the patients you serve, or with your team or clinic. We'll talk a little bit about some of the ideas that you might think about in that way. And then in talking about a practice-based research network and thinking about objectives, one of the things was ensuring that there were good peer review articles that could be associated with this. Those oftentimes generate from practice-based research networks as a proximity to this kind of idea. There's not a lot of obviously generalizable research that comes out of things that are designed to not be generalizable research. So, should you decide to go further and develop a practice-based research network and attain that fame, fortune, and glory that accompanies the world of published research, what are some of the things that you might look at? So if we talk about the idea of research versus quality improvement, taking directly from VHA Directive 1200.5, this is a tremendously long document. I've embedded the actual document here, but I don't see it. So I'll see if I can pass that along if folks are interested. It's a very long, just recently updated directive regarding the working with human research participants. And basically the definition that's laid out right at the beginning is that research means a systematic investigation, including research development, testing, and evaluation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. It's that design or contribute to generalizable knowledge that becomes a particularly important element when we talk about this. When you're talking about quality improvement or process improvement, the focus really is on the clinic. It really is on the patient that's in front of you. It really is on that particular group that you've been working to develop and to refine for a particular population that you serve. And it's intended to stay there. It's not something that you're designing and initially intending to be something that is going to result in a publication. If you're really thinking about contributing to generalizable knowledge in any way, shape, or form, then the thing that you want to do is make sure that you are following the research. Sorry, it's Charlotte. Are you able to hear me, or am I?
You were cutting in and out just a little bit, but that sounds perfect now. It was just coming in and out just a little bit ago. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. The second element there is thinking about what then would be a reasonable definition for quality improvement. One of the places that actually has a pretty good page of information and some pretty good ideas is the American Academy of Family Physicians. They actually are also a group that has done quite a bit with regard to practice-based research networks. But again, they define quality improvement as a systemic, formal approach to the analysis of practice performance and efforts to improve performance. Again, the idea there is still that it's a systematic, formal approach, that you are using those skills that you learned as a researcher, quite frankly, to inform that particular analysis, to inform that particular project that is designed to improve practice performance and improve clinical performance and practice performance overall. So when we talk about this and the steps that we'll move forward with, the emphasis again is on engaging in activities that would fall in line with quality improvement, process improvement, rather than research. But the principles that we use to engage in research are going to be the same that can drive these particular projects and produce, hopefully, for us some interesting and reliable improvements that we may be able to bring to those clinics and patients that we serve. So in terms of doing this one patient at a time, yes, I understand clinical practice is often very busy. Having been a staff clinician, having worked in the front lines as well, especially within the VA these days and the increasing emphasis on bookability and time and productivity and so on and so forth, the schedule is very busy. At least for me, and again, this is my bias, when you begin to do that to a degree, or have that busyness to the degree that you begin to detach from some of your own identity. For me, detaching from that inner researcher became a real challenge. It can cause some dissatisfaction, perhaps, with what you're doing. Now, the answer to that isn't always work harder, but in this case, the idea is that are there things that bring you joy? Are there processes that would help you really engage with what you are doing in a different way that might provide additional energy resource benefit to yourself as well as to those that you're working with? Every person that we work with, every individual or group that we serve can teach us something new. It's something that I really think is an important aspect of our particular practice. Each individual that we work with, regardless of history, diagnosis, other characteristics that we might look at, can teach us something new. And in that sense, each one of those individuals, or each one of those groups, provides a real opportunity for us to systematically understand what that individual or what that process might be teaching us. So you can tap into that inner researcher to benefit the patients, to benefit your patients and you in that sense. The idea is that when working with one patient at a time, really we're talking about single subject designs. You can get pretty darn sophisticated depending upon the setting that you're in, depending upon the kinds of resources that might be available to the population that you're working with. Some of the examples that are brought up, for example, in the chapter that's listed below, which I think is a very solid chapter with good, clear language to be able to read and understand this. Has to do with, for example, smoking cessation programs and the involvement of different kinds of interventions that can be utilized there, and following different approaches that would work that would allow you to try different kinds of interventions and track how people are doing at that particular time. Otherwise, one of the ways to think about it is simple A/B design. The idea of this is the current status, and then I'm going to engage in this particular approach and see what happens in terms of that. And you want to consider the length of the baseline, your A part, to see how long both you can gather some information or need to gather some information before you begin to implement an additional intervention or change to what you're doing at that particular time. The thing that becomes important at those points or at that point is the next 4 steps that will be consistent throughout the remainder of what we'll talk about in terms of whether or not we're working with a single patient, whether or not we're working with a team or a clinic, or thinking more broadly. Decide what you want to follow. um, follow it. I know that sounds basic, but really follow it. Um, Take the time to actually uh, to actually analyze and reflect on what you found and what you're working with, and then begin to apply your findings. So in deciding what you want to follow, be systematic in your observations. That doesn't mean right off the bat that you are administering a dozen measures. It doesn't mean right off the bat that you've got a sophisticated approach already with a particular individual that you're working with. But be thinking about the kinds of things that may be of an influence, that may be of interest to you and to the individuals you serve. You can certainly use measures. The advent and increasing application of measurement-based care will make this far easier in terms of having that data available, ready at your fingertips on a regular basis. But you can also think about this in terms of how those measures or what those measures might be looking at. Are they symptom-focused measures? Are they the kinds of measures that look at functional outcomes for a particular individual? Are they relational measures that have to do with particular types of approaches that may emphasize the relational aspect of the psychotherapy? Whatever it might be, understand that what you want to have is some sort of a measure that you're going to use in following those particular elements, those particular observations will be supplemented by some sort of measurement that you're using on a regular basis with the individual. And in this case, be creative. There's all kinds of different things that we can look at that might be of interest to your particular practice. Perhaps it is something about time of day. I personally, as a clinician, the time of day I struggled with the most was the 1 o'clock appointment right after lunch in my non-windowed office that was relatively warm. I, in all honesty, was not the most focused clinician at that point. And as much effort as I put into it to be that focused clinician, I always wondered, well, might that have impacted the outcome for the patients I served at that time? And, if I engaged in a process like this at that time, would I have been able to identify that as a time of day where I didn't want to work in a psychotherapy setting, that I would set something else for that particular time? What about lighting? Use the overhead fluorescent lights or just lamp lights, floor lights, something along those lines? And how might that affect different aspects? What about informal conversation prior to, quote, digging in psychotherapy? We all know those particular individuals that we work with who come in and want to talk about either the weather or perhaps the latest sports news or who knows what. For some, that's a really important way of easing into it. For others, maybe we're seeing that as a real way of avoiding the content of a particular session and what we want to be working on and getting to. And how then does that affect what we do? So it doesn't have to be something that you've really looked for and identified as a very, very specific variable that's been identified in clinical trials or that's been identified in other research settings, but really, as you're looking to improve your practice, as you're looking to better understand how you can better serve those that come to you, what are the kinds of creative things that you can think of to improve your practice? Maybe that leads to something else, but maybe it leads to really, again, improved services for those that we're working with. And again, be realistic. This is not a randomized control trial. You don't have a staff. You don't have a very carefully selected patient population that comes in with one diagnosis that has only one thing going on and they've never received treatment. The folks that we're working with typically are going to be complicated and there's going to be lots of stuff. Your job in this idea or your goal in this particular setting is not to develop something that is absolutely airtight, but to use research principles to more systematically understand those that you work with and how we might affect different things to improve the care that we provide. And in that sense, perhaps, find a little enjoyment there. And I'd be remiss without citing, good old Paul Handel. Bill, I know you remember him. It's all data. Everything that we encounter with regard to the folks we work with, that we identify in the clinics and the settings around us, and even in our day to day. It's all data. So consider it as something that's potentially something you might follow, or you might look into, or you might systematically track in some way. So again, being creative in that sense. Once you've decided what to follow, make sure you follow it. Commit to following your chosen data. It does take extra time. It does take extra effort. It does take extra um, time, perhaps in the morning or in the afternoons or over lunch that you're doing. That's going to allow you to do this. But commit to following it and do it very consistently. If you get behind, if you let it slide once, if you let it slide twice, it's not going to, it's unlikely that it'll get picked up and really be something that you engage in pretty actively. Consider involving those that you serve. Consider involving your patients. Again, this is not an RCT. We're not looking for something that's going to produce a publishable result in PsychBowl or JPSP or JCCP or something along those lines. So perhaps there are things that those that you serve might identify as something that you're going to follow, and have them participate in that. Maybe they're bringing in information from the outside. Maybe they're giving you feedback on how things went following a particular session. And again, take the time to both collect and record the data. And as a sub-note there, be cognizant of regulations about record keeping in PHI and PII. Certainly don't be walking off campus or out of your clinic with those kinds of things, and understand the regulations in your particular facility about alternate medical records and so on and so forth, or whatever setting you might be in that particular location. And then determine the time frames before you start. So rather than just say, I think I'll follow this for a little while, or I might identify this for a little bit, or maybe we'll track this for a bit, really focus in on what time frame do you want to look at this over? How often do you want to collect this information? And when are you going to essentially pause, look at the data, and see what comes next? Those are important things to help you be systematic in this approach and using your inner researcher to improve care one patient at a time. You want to be systematic about that aspect and tap into those previous research skills that you have to help you define the parameters around which you're both going to collect and begin to look at that data. Which takes us to that next component, that's taking the time to analyze and reflect. Again, one of the neat things about working with single case designs is that visual inspection of the data is a pretty common way of looking at the kinds of data that you would collect with individuals. Going back to the chapter that I cited earlier, one of the things that they know is that you essentially chart out the data, graph out the data. You can attend to the levels, the trends, the variability within and across phases that you've engaged to give yourself some information. Depending upon what's happening in those particular situations, you may have different phases across time. Perhaps you're seeing somebody over a long period of time, and you're looking at whether how reliable they are in attending scheduled sessions, and perhaps those phases are seasons. In certain parts of the country, attending sessions in certain seasons may be more difficult than others, and perhaps that is a component of it. Perhaps it's also looking at whether or not it's time of day that changes for that particular individual, or if you change other aspects about your particular practice that you do. It may be also, again, when you implemented a particular intervention, or when you might have shifted gears in response to how the person that you're working with might be doing, or feedback that they might be providing you. But it can be a visual data analysis. It doesn't have to be a sophisticated statistical regression analysis or more in terms of beginning to understand how to use the information you gathered. Take the time to think about what the data are telling you, and what are your hypotheses about what that data are telling you. By that same token, then, involve a colleague if you can. I know you can start getting to where we're dragging other people into our own inner researcher needs. but that's part of it anyway. Um, what does it tell them? It's a great way to test your hypotheses, to consider alternate hypotheses, to consider alternate approaches to what's going on. Again, the idea is that that systematic approach, that research-based philosophy that you take in terms of improving care, can be something that provides a pretty powerful way of better serving those that come to us. And then what about, is there anything essentially that the data is telling your patient? There's no reason why this can't be shared in terms of graphing it out and discussing it with the individual that you're serving at that point. These kinds of approaches, again, provide that kind of detail that can be useful to those individuals beyond just your own interests, your own approaches, and help a particular patient that you're working with better understand how what they've been doing or what they've been working on in clinic or the kinds of things that they've been doing in their day-to-day life have impacted their overall symptomatology or function or whatever you might have decided to track at that point. And then apply your findings. If a change of approach is suggested, what change will you make? Is it going to involve a change in time of day, a change in lighting? Is it going to involve a change of approach? If you make a change, how will you assess the impact of that? Will you continue to follow? Will you continue to track that particularly and understand how your change may or may not have impacted the process in which you're engaged in? And what additional questions does it bring up in this situation and or more broadly? So this is sort of leaning towards now, oh, well, I found this out for this particular individual. I wonder if all of the individuals whom I serve with this particular diagnosis, or who come in at this particular time, or who are in this particular clinic, or are attending this particular treatment that I engage in, how would that apply there? I think there'll be some additional components to that. And following along in the chat a little bit, I'll come to the questions about the questions about working with clinic-wide data analyses here in just a minute, and thinking about how you might work with your team to do that. And then I'll discuss a little bit about a private practice and IRB approval in the end. That'll be something I can say very basically, but I not provide a lot of great information on. Find some more information. So in transitioning from that individual, and as this hobby takes hold, and you really do find that feeding your inner researcher is, well, kind of fun, and you want to do some more of this, perhaps larger questions emerge. Again, am I more effective with treatment X or treatment Y? Does time of day effect impact my effectiveness across a variety of different patients? Do those, for example, who get an orientation to psychotherapy complete more sessions, have a lower no-show rate? Again, the similar research principles can be brought to bear. Decide what you want to measure, and decide what you want to better understand to improve care for those you serve. Follow it. The added component here is decide how you would like to analyze the data here, more so than perhaps with an individual, visual approaches or basic statistics. Time to analyze and reflect, and then apply your findings. The same idea. You're now including more folks in that approach, though. And the part that I'll highlight again is decide how you would like to analyze the data. If you're going to use a visual approach, what might you do? Is it going to be a line graph where you have a whole bunch of lines superimposed over each other? Or might you do something, for example, like this, where you bring up bar charts for a group of different individuals that you've served over time? One group of which has received an orientation to psychotherapy and one group which has not. And begin to eyeball the information there to get an idea of which one is attending more sessions, which one seems to be more consistently engaging for a longer term or the appropriate amount of time that I would expect for this particular psychotherapy. Again, it's not looking to identify a particular analysis that's then going to result in a publication, but it is going to help you consider, all right, well, if I eyeball this, it looks like this one group sticks around a little bit more than the other, so perhaps I should do this some more. Again, there may be other variables involved. You want to use your own research skills in thinking about alternate hypotheses, engaging in conversations with colleagues to determine if some of those are there. But the idea here, again, is to really use those skills to identify how can I improve things in my day-to-day, and how can I improve the services that I'm providing to those that I serve. And so it can be a relatively, something as relatively straightforward and simple as simply plugging numbers into an Excel spreadsheet without any sort of identifying information, and then having it use one of its creating a graph tools to pop something like this and have an idea of what's there. If you have enough data, you can consider getting serious in your hobby and actually do some basic statistical analysis. Again, just using statistics does not mean that it is now formal research. If it's still for quality improvement and not generalizable knowledge or publication, it's not research. So you can use statistics. It's okay. And there's all kinds of different online calculators that can help you perform simple statistics like mean and standard deviation or even t-scores once you have that basic information. You may have access to other more sophisticated statistical packages, but again, to a large degree, many of these calculators are available online for simple statistics for free that you can use to begin to generate some information. Again, for your groups, for yourself, for your quality improvement project. Not, again, something that you're going to publish or move into. So, and some other ideas about whether or not you'd use a T or a Z-score. You can get into more sophisticated understandings about how many folks you work with and what you might be working with, depending upon the number of people that you include in your groups of patients that you're serving. And then finally, what you want to think about in terms of, again, the overall process is following it all the way through to have the time to analyze and reflect and to apply your findings. That's a particularly important part of it in terms of how it'll work with. Now, in moving to thinking a little bit about how you might do this at the team or the clinic level, or your inner researcher is running wild and you've decided to involve others. I'm sure they're really delighted to be a part of. You really want to be thinking about what are those questions at the team or the clinic level that you might be talking about. Perhaps they are looking at, very the more traditional ideas with regard to overall performance or overall improvement for individuals who are attending your clinic for treatment for a particular diagnosis, or who have come from a particular referral source, who are in a particular age cohort, something along those lines. But again, you can also be creative in terms of your quality improvement projects to think about things that perhaps are a little bit more outside the box. There's these are all phrases that I have pulled from my experience as a technical assistant specialist and working with different facilities and clinics around the country. And nobody shows up for late afternoon appointments. Stated as a fact. Having the news on in the waiting room is stressing out my clients, right? That's one that I put in because working as a clinician in the VA, and I think it was about 2007, just remember walking into the waiting room one day and one of the news channels was on showing pretty much live combat footage, and the tension in the waiting room was palpable. Just had to work. But, it's stressing out my clients. How can I our patients don't want evidence-based therapies. Okay? Enter your favorite fact regarding your clinic. What are those sort of assumptions, those sort of things that are said about the performance of your clinic or your team that you might want to address, that may fall beyond some of those particular ideas and specific questions about symptoms, outcomes, overall performance, that fall into areas that you might think about as ways to use those research skills to improve not only the care that's being provided, but also to answer some of these particular questions that are around. Note at the bottom what I placed is the emphasis in this section is deliberately not on questions that may arise in the context of already collected administrative data or performance metrics. In other words, I'm staying away from my job in this, in terms of what we do as mental health technical assistant specialists with utilizing VA data that are collected for performance metrics and overall data. The emphasis here instead is on those questions that may be particularly unique to a clinic staff, to a setting of staff. You really need to work on buy-in in this sense. Be clear about what you think the question is, seek feedback from the team, and be ready to modify that question accordingly. It will have to be a collaborative process with your teammates if you're going to get into buy-in. Agree on expectations. Are you now going to require some sort of particular change or ask some particular change? What's going to be collected? Who will do it? Talk about how it's going to be analyzed, how it'll be shared, and when it'll be shared. And what will the process be for discussing the impact, incorporation, or utilization of the findings of the team clinic. The first step is to use that inner researcher to both shape the discussion. In other words, you want to keep it reasonable. You want to keep it, it could very rapidly expand out into 437 different variables over 9 months with 6,412 patients. That's not feasible. How can you begin to parse some of those out and think about it in a systematic way, in a research-based approach, that you would begin to identify one particular variable or one particular thing, or maybe two that you want to follow, and begin to shape the quality improvement project that way. That also takes your skill as a psychologist. Now it gets into the small print. Decide what you want to better understand. These are the same principles, but expanded out at the clinic level. A robust discussion, again, could lead to an unwieldy idea, so you want to shape them. If those approaches are different, what do you want to do? If it's not news on the TV, then what? Sports, home improvement channel, health education programming. Follow it. Again, you don't have lots of resources for this. You have you. Now, you may be a great resource, but it's you. It's not an RCT. It's not an RO1. It's something that you want to keep. Decide how you want to analyze the data. And be mindful of your audience, the people that you're going to work with, and take time to analyze, reflect, and apply your findings. Running very short. Now, again, this is the idea that starts to come up with some of these the questions in the chat box. What if you're going to make the transition to research? Using your own inner researcher to benefit, to improve your own practice or help your team or clinic can benefit those you serve and be reporting to you. Yes, that's a sales job. But if you do find it brings its own form of enjoyment, you may consider moving to more formal research, genuinely intended to contribute to generalized knowledge base, get published. Again, what you've engaged in as a quality improvement project may significantly inform the foundation for research, but there's a whole lot more additional considerations when you move to this idea of engaging in a research, in actual research. So the idea, again, of setting up a clinic repository to enable and systematize clinic-wide data analysis, as is asked about, is something that would be preparatory to research. I would think that it would be something that it may be looking towards that. It may not be. Perhaps that is, again, something that you're really looking to just for quality improvement projects, which is great. And being able to do that does require the idea of some of the same, back up very, very quickly, some of the same ideas in terms of really getting buy-in from your particular team and agreeing on the expectations. It's got to be a collaborative discussion up front. It's got to be a clear discussion up front with an idea and an understanding of how that will then be processed. And if folks want to modify it, change it, add, subtract, what's the process for that as well? The earlier you can establish that kind of specification for developing a clinic-wide data repository, more readily your team will be able to both engage in, utilize, and follow up on that particular repository. When you do move to research, again, it may involve specific training and certification. There may be additional time and resources that are necessary for data security, for informed consent, for reviews, etc. And typically they do need to be submitted to an IRB. In a private practice, that's a particularly a particularly difficult challenge. Oftentimes, if you can affiliate with universities, it is sometimes helpful, and whether or not they'll be able to do that. There are also private IRBs that you can pay to review and oversee your project if you do not have access to it. So again, additional time and resources are necessary. Practice-based research networks are groups of practices that are banded together to conduct research. Mainly, one of the primary areas that actually developed out of was again, family practice medicine, and really beginning to look to see how they could understand that. There's a couple articles here that provide some good background with regard to the development of those particular practice-based research networks and how therapists and researchers can come together in some of those kinds of settings to advance collaboration, and begin to produce more clinically relevant research. Again, moving beyond quality improvement into formal research. Large, large practice-based research networks may involve clinics across states or countries. There are collaborations that have been developed among psychology training clinics. There have been collaborations that have been developed across different private practices. So there's a lot that can be done in those areas, but again, it's resource intensive. Each site has to maintain that local infrastructure to conduct research, and the planning becomes absolutely essential when you're really expanding across settings. And just beyond that, there is some reason to really be optimistic about the idea that actually doing this improves healthcare performance. So there are some additional benefits beyond that which we see. Smaller PBRNs are a little bit more localized. They may be groups of practitioners who agree to collaborate on research in their clinical settings. And again, you can begin to identify some particular aspects. One group that has sort of dispersed at this point, we're a group of folks down in San Antonio that each of them maintained their own research training. They found ways to have regular meetings to discuss ideas, and they produced some really, really interesting research, some really clinically relevant research that had important impacts and I think important things to say that move beyond what some of our robust RCTs in terms of methodology and statistics can provide. In terms of what's it like day to day, and what can we look at helps us better understand the actual practical application. So going back to these ideas, these were the basic objectives that we talked about. Hopefully we got some information on these with regard to each one of the objectives that we address. The idea being that somewhere inside of us we have an inner researcher that's been trained into us. And maybe that inner researcher is quite happily dormant, and maybe that inner researcher is something that would really like to be fed. And there's a way to do that without having to go through the process of engaging in research, of writing grants, of doing statistical analysis, of publishing, but using those skills, that inner researcher, those resources that you have to improve the care of the person that's sitting in front of you, to improve the care of the clinic that you're working in, and then potentially to begin to think about the fame, fortune, and glory that published research.
Well, thank you so much. As you
All
can
right,
see,
that's
there
what
are
I
a
think.
few questions in the chat box. I don't know if you want to start addressing those first, and then if other people would like to put another question in the chat box, or if you'd like to actually just directly ask the question, just raise your hand and I'll open the microphone up for you.
I think I talked a little bit about setting up the clinical repositories and some of those aspects. I think I talked a little bit about setting up the clinical repositories and some of those aspects. And Mary, I'm not sure I can give you any additional information beyond IRB, affiliating or really looking at one of the essentially for pay IRB.
All right. Well, if there's not any other questions, I really want to thank you so much for this presentation. As someone who came from an academic background into the VA, this is one of these areas that is really very near and dear to my heart, and certainly a part that I'm hoping to go towards myself. So this was a really helpful presentation for me, and I think we probably will hear that from the other attendees as well. And I'm sorry I didn't mention this at the beginning. For those of you who may be new to our webinars, the slides are actually available for you under the files. You can just download those there. You'll also find on there too also some information about our division as well as the upcoming webinar series. Any closing words, Dr. Klocek?
Other than to say thanks for the opportunity, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to this group. Other than to say thanks for the opportunity, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to this group and share my own enthusiasm for the inner researcher that hopefully folks will engage in.
Well, and thank you for your bio.
We
really appreciate that too.
Thank you very
finally,
much.
Disclosing for everyone is that for those of you who are part of Division 18, you can receive a CE for attending. There will be a follow-up email coming to you as long as you signed up through Sign Up Genius. If you did not, if you could just reach out to me before you log off of this, that would be great. And we will be having another seminar next month, and I don't have that in front of me right now, but we will have a March seminar. Oh, it's about the history of VA psychology, presented by Dr. Rodney Baker. So we'll be sending out information about that as well. So thank you all so much for also forgiving my technical difficulties at the beginning, and I hope I didn't take any time away from this wonderful presentation.